What made that night wrong wasn't a bang. It was the silence that filled the cab and refused to leave. I've been on the road long enough to know the orchestra of an empty rest stop. Distant rigs breathing through their idle tuners, the dull hum of a generator, a dog barking far off, the occasional rattle of a loose step. That night on I-10 at about 2 in the morning, the sounds I'd come to rely on were there, and then stripped away like a blanket. The hum of a refrigerated trailer, something I could usually feel more than hear, cut out entirely. The place felt paused, like everything was holding its breath. I prefer not to give my name. That's part habit, part caution. There's a small privacy among us drivers that sometimes feels like the last honest thing left out here. But I know the miles, what they teach you, what they take, and this one taught me to treat silence the way you treat a warning light on the dash. Pay attention and don't assume it's a false alarm. I pulled into the rest stop on the northbound side because I needed a break. The cab felt heavy with diesel and coffee. The yellow poles cast their weak glare, and the lot held maybe 2 trailers besides mine. I parked a little farther than usual, partly because it was quiet and partly because that's how habits form. An inch of space becomes a margin of safety without you thinking about it. My cargo that run was ordinary. Nothing special. The refrigeration unit on the nearest trailer was supposed to be running. I could tell by the type of liners, but the sound wasn't there. Instead, there was a metallic tapping, soft, measured, coming from somewhere down that row. It wasn't a machine failing. It had a cadence like someone testing a surface. At first I thought some cat had found refuge under a trailer. Cat in a rest stop at 2 in the morning, sure. I left the keys in my pocket and stepped out to take a look, because sometimes you check these things out of simple curiosity, and because the feeling in my chest told me to look. The air smelled of dust and coolant. My boots scuffed gravel. The tapping stopped when I got close enough to hear it clearly, and that's one of those little details that doesn't seem like much until you string it together with the rest. I turned my light toward the nearest trailer and saw the motor was cold. There was no condensation on the door gasket, nothing you'd expect when a unit had been cycling. It was allowed for a trailer to be off at night, but I'd been near those trailers enough to know when something wasn't right. Then a pickup rolled into the far corner and parked at a strange angle. Not the casual pull you do when your buddy's truck shows up to say hello, not the neat, practical park of a yard hand. It settled into the space like it had been placed there on purpose, its headlights off, engine idling low. A man stepped out slow and precise. He carried a heavy-looking tool, not a wrench or a ratchet that belongs to a driver, but something denser, the kind of thing that shifts attention when you see it. He walked the edge of the trailers, stopping now and then as if listening. If you could imagine a predator that's learned the language of trucks, that's the best way to explain it. He spoke with his steps, testing the answers. I shouldn't have gone closer. I know that now. There's a reason the rulebook among drivers says keep your distance, keep doors locked, trust your gut. But I'd been conditioned to be check-minded. If something's wrong with a unit, I'll report it. If someone's in trouble, I might be the person who helps. The choice was ordinary until it wasn't. When I called out, it was a small thing. "You all right over there?" The man looked up, smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes, and said he was fine. His voice was calm. Too calm. He lied about routine things the way a surgeon lies to themselves between operations. Then came the glass, the sound sharp enough to split the night. My passenger window took the impact, spider-webbing like frost. The first piece fell inward. I stepped back, hands up, because that's how you react when your brain is trying to buy you a second or two. He didn't run. He moved like he had rehearsed it, a smooth, practiced reach toward the cab. I made a choice that felt both savage and simple. I fired the engine. I didn't wrestle with thoughts of heroism. I thought of escape, absence of choice. I put the truck into motion, not in some cinematic barrel-through stunt, but in a steady, necessary shove that carried me past where the pickup should have cornered me. The pickup eased to block, but I wasn't giving them the perfect trap. They battered my window and scraped the cab. I felt a shard nick my forearm. It wasn't a wound to write home about, but it left me with the coppery smell of blood and a new awareness of how fragile the barricades we trust can be. Once I cleared the parking area, I didn't stop on the shoulder to gawk. I took the next exit and doubled back farther down the highway before I pulled over to check the damage. The glass had been shattered enough that the wind whistled through the open seam. My arm ached. The tool they'd used had left a mark near the frame, evidence that the intention had been violent and specific. I called dispatch, gave them the bare facts, then filed a report only in the most necessary language. I didn't give them everything I could remember. Small details, names, how many steps he took. People ask why sometimes, we don't always tell. There's a mixture of pride and fear, pride in surviving, fear that full details lead nowhere but to stories that get replayed in court or worse. There are also practical concerns out here. Telling too much can turn you into a target for people who keep lists. After that night, I started to treat silence as if it were a loose animal. Where I'd once found peace in the empty moments, I now felt a pressure, a tautness. The road had always been indifferent. I'd learned to respect that. Now it felt actively cunning. Small things, like a fridge that wasn't running or a vehicle that parked in the wrong angle, became signals that warranted a pause. You don't become paranoid overnight. You become careful in increments, an inch at a time. The rest of the drive that week was quiet in the obvious ways, but noisy under the surface. My mind replayed the tapping, the way the man moved, the way my engine's rumble sounded like an exhale when I pulled away. I slept poorly, the cab lights turning the cushions into strange, familiar shapes. When other drivers asked how it went, I gave them the circular, boring version. Someone broke a window, I hauled out. That was enough for the road's etiquette. You tell the world what it needs to know and tuck away the rest. If you like these real road stories, hit like and drop a quick thought. What would you have done? I didn't think that night was unique. Predators adapt to the rhythms of the road. They test, they listen, they stage scenes that bait the instinct to help. The man at I-10 had used silence like a lure. The road itself was complicit, not malicious, but the vast empty spaces give bad actors opportunities they wouldn't have in a crowded place. A couple months later, I sat across from Travis Cole in a diner outside Las Vegas. He'd been on the road for 20 years, had that certain worn clarity in his face, and when he spoke, he did so with the trimmed efficiency of someone who's had to make decisions under pressure more times than he wishes to count. His voice was flat at first, the kind of flatness that comes from repeating a scene to yourself until it hurts. People always say, don't pick up hitchhikers on the open road. You hear it enough, you stop thinking about it, he told me. But then you see somebody there with the hood up, and everything that feels human about you wants to help. Travis's run that night took place on a strip of highway where there isn't much. No cell towers, no brightly lit exits for miles. He'd been moving at the kind of steady speed you settle into when the road is a long, indifferent line. Headlights cut through the dark like scalpels. He saw the sedan at the side, the hood propped and the hazard lights blinking. He pulled over out of habit and something like empathy. That decision is where this gets quiet in a whole different way, because the quiet wasn't the absence of sound this time. It was how composed the other person was. The man got into his cab without the hurry or the tremor you expect from someone stranded in the desert. He smelled faintly of the inside of a household, not roadside grease, soap, maybe, and the trace of a cigarette. He sat and smiled. Then he said the name of Travis's daughter. Names are things that anchor you. You hear your child's name and the center of your world shifts. It's a soft, private weight that people don't carry casually. He said the name without prompting, with the casualness of someone pulling a file from a folder. Travis felt the hair rise along his arms, an instinctive, irrational jolt that your internal alarm system sends when it recognizes something out of place. At first he thought it was coincidence. Maybe his daughter had her name on social media. Maybe the man had a neighbor with the same name. Then details followed that made coincidence stretch thin. A description of the color of the curtains in his house, a passing mention of the street where his mother used to drop off packages. Not specifics that would read as evidence in court, but the kind of things a stranger shouldn't know that weren't the sort of small talk strangers make. Travis started to notice the little checks the man made while he talked, the way a hand brushed the seat beside him, the way his boots rested like they were ready to move. There were also things the man didn't do. He didn't ask for a ride to the next exit. He didn't ask for money. He catalogued instead of pleading. He was composed, the kind of person who catalogues keeps lists. Travis told me he'd seen knives in pockets before. You see them and your brain catalogues them as part of a mundane landscape, tools and weapons that have to share space out here. That night a folded blade was tucked with surgical discretion to the man's boot. Nothing flashed, nothing brandished, just a thin promise of harm waiting under the edge of a shoe. It was the not showing that made it dangerous. Concealment meant he could decide whether the world would notice. What's different is when they know things about you without asking, Travis said. That's when it stops being about help and starts feeling like surveillance. Travis didn't panic. You don't if you've been hauling loads across deserts for years. Panic makes you predictable. He did something simple and deliberate. He slowed down, casually shifted his route direction by the smallest degree that wouldn't look odd and would at the same time give him the option to get to a safer, more public spot. It's the kind of move you make when you're buying yourself time without telegraphing decision-making to the other party. He scanned for other cars, for lit spaces. He took the exit he always avoided at night, the one with a truck stop that had a maintenance lot and a couple of cameras, public enough to matter. As he drove, he kept his hands where the man could see them and kept his eyes on the road. He didn't get into a confrontation. He didn't make sudden moves. He made room to act when he could. When he pulled into a well-lit area, he eased the cab to a stop, opened his door on the opposite side, and stepped out like a man who had to stretch his legs. He made a loop around the truck, glanced at the sedan, and when he finally got back to his side, he locked the doors from the outside. He didn't go back to the sedan. He didn't talk. He called dispatch and let them know what he'd seen, then left the area. That would be where a lot of people think the story ends, an act of quiet, sensible avoidance. Travis, though, told me about how it lingered in his head for months. He stopped taking rides on remote stretches. He checked his mirrors like he was expecting someone to slip into the blind spot with a smile. He slept less easy. He learned to separate instinctive compassion from the small economized risk the road imposes. There was a last detail Travis shared that sat heavy between the coffee steam and the chipped formica of the diner table. The man in the sedan hadn't looked desperate. He'd been patient, like someone who had time to wait for a pattern to fall into place, like he knew exactly what would make a driver stop, and then used that. It wasn't desperation that made him dangerous. It was calculation. I remember sitting there, the neon sign buzzing outside and those words settling in. Calculation. Predators on the road often don't need to be loud. They'll be courteous. They'll show a need. They'll be the sort of presence that sets you thinking about kids and medicine, and the human thing that makes you cross the highway to help. Their power is in shaping what you think you should do. When I left that diner, it was daylight, and the memory of the I-10 night sat like a bruise. Travis's story layered onto it, skipped the wound open and let the light in. Two different methods, same goal: find the gap and step into it. That pattern, staging need, showing small details to build trust, using silence or knowledge as leverage, keeps repeating in the stories that come through truck stops and message boards. People call them tricks, the honest ones call them patterns. I started listening for the common language in each, what the predator offered and what he expected in return. Curiosity, sympathy, ritual. You can recognize those things if you spend enough nights noticing them. A few weeks later, I drove into a yard in New Mexico for a scheduled unloading that shouldn't have been anything more than a paperwork exchange. Caleb Turner was the one who told me about what happened in that yard, and his voice didn't have the tight, clipped humor of someone making light. It had the low, steady cadence of someone who'd had the wind knocked out of him by practicality. They'd shut the yard down like a trap, he said, and the look on his face was the sort that makes you stop talking. Caleb's job that night was normal on paper. The lights were the wrong color, harsh, too white for the area. There were extra trailers where there shouldn't have been. It was one of those places where the signage was faded and the shadows held more than they should. He'd been waiting for clearance to back in. That's when he noticed them, men moving between trailers with boxes that didn't match the manifest on his clipboard. Movements choreographed like a bad stage play where everyone was trying too hard to look natural. They weren't hurried. They weren't clumsy. They were deliberate. He watched one man glance his way, and the air changed. A gate that had hung open when he pulled in closed and then locked. The sound wasn't loud. It was the small mechanical click of latch and chain, but it was enough to make the space feel shaped. Headlights flashed from different angles and the trailers formed a corridor. Caleb's cab suddenly felt smaller than it had 15 minutes earlier. He told me about the moment he realized the transfer wasn't official, a box that passed beneath a tarp, and the way the men coordinated without talking. This wasn't about someone getting a shortcut through a bureaucracy. This was organized. Once you sense that, options dwindle. There's a kind of pressure that comes from being contained, from the road folding in on you. I could see the gate, Caleb said. I could see the chain and I could see the men. I knew if I stayed I would be boxed. He described the decision then in clinical terms, not of bravado, but of necessity. He used the truck as his means. It was a brutal, risky choice, and he didn't talk about it like a trick. He talked about it like a calculation made under duress. He pushed. The gate didn't come off the hinges like in the movies. It sagged and dragged, and for a moment there was this thin sliver of escape that might have been enough. This is the kind of thing you don't reenact, not because it won't be dramatic, but because the specifics can be dangerous if turned into instructions. Caleb later filed a report. He didn't give every detail to anybody public. The yard itself was the kind of place that could be skipped on a map by those who didn't want attention, and the men there had the calm of people used to moving in the dark edges of legitimate work. What ties all these nights together is a quiet process. Predators learn the language of drivers and the rhythm of the road. They orchestrate scenes that look ordinary. A refrigerator that isn't running becomes a story about maintenance. A man with a hood up becomes a plea that strikes at the humane side of you. A locked gate becomes an instrument of confinement. They test boundaries by nudging at them, watching to see whether you react. I could tell you how each of those stories ended in the shorthand that fills forums. Someone escaped, someone walked away, someone filed a report. But those endings don't capture the slow changes that followed. You start to treat oddities as warnings. You stop taking the default route home. You find yourself checking the mirrors more often. You notice the way your hands rest on the wheel and the tiny hairs on your forearm go taut when a stranger calls your child's name. The road doesn't stop being a place of work, of music on the radio, of sunrises and the specific smell of diesel after rain. It just becomes a place where your caution grows teeth. You still drive, you still sleep in the cab, you still pull into rest stops, but you do it with a new vocabulary, patterns, rehearsals, nursing the small alarms the way you nurse a temperature. When we left the diner, Travis told me he still drives. When Caleb booked another route a week after, he told me he chose runs that avoided yard waiting at night. Me. I keep my window intact when I can, and when I can't, I keep the stories filed away like extra maps, useful to pull out when you need to find your way. I wanted to hear more from Travis, how exactly the man knew his daughter's name, whether he'd ever tried to find out later who that man was. I wanted to press Caleb on the exact moment he decided to go, how his hands moved on the wheel. In that split second the gate sagged. Those were the parts that make a good true crime forum thread, the meat of the adrenaline. But those details aren't always helpful. They don't always make anything safer. Travis's voice in the diner still sounded thin when he described how he'd felt the name land in his chest. You don't get used to that feeling, he said. You just learn what to do when it hits. Then he stared at his coffee like the cup had answers. He told me slowly about the first flicker, how the man's gaze kept returning to his paperwork, as if checking that the things on that paper matched him as a target. The man spoke about small domesticities in a way that was casual but precise. A daughter's name, an offhand comment about a porch light left on. It was the kind of data predators collect without being noticed. Trivial detail is the scaffolding for trust. Travis's reaction was to create distance, to look for light, to find open, observed space and move toward it. But even that method of escape felt like it could fail. The choices we make are often about buying time, not buying a guarantee. He said something that stuck with me. They don't need to do anything dramatic if we give them the stage. We do most of the work. That line lives in the underside of all three stories, a common chord you can strum across separate nights. I pressed him a little. Only the soft edges, the things you ask someone who wants to be heard but doesn't want to relive. Would he ever give a hitchhiker a ride again? He shrugged. Not on empty stretches, he said. Not when there's no one else around. It wasn't bravado. It was simple recalibration, a rerouting of habits. It felt like the polite, painful work of someone remapping how to live in a place that had changed its rules without a notice. We sat in the lot a little longer and watched headlights take and leave the horizon. There was a thin wind that picked up dust and made the parking lights flash like slow pulses. That night, between the I-10 silence and Travis's careful withdrawal, there was a pattern forming in my head. It wasn't just about predators. It was about how the road gives you choices by degrees. Little ethical and practical decisions that become the difference between being a statistic and being a story that ends with you still in the driver's seat. I had the urge then to keep asking, to keep prying at those seams until the whole fabric came loose. How many of them learned where the trucks park? How many of them watched the rest stops like a chessboard? But there's a limit to what you can know without endangering other drivers or propagating methods. So I folded those questions away and listened instead for the things the men said when they didn't think anyone would read them. Travis finished his coffee and stood to leave. He clipped his keys with the sort of gesture that tells you he'll be back on the road by dusk. "You ever hear of someone doing anything like this and getting caught?" he asked, not really asking. The answer was a long, elusive thread. Some got arrested, some vanished, some were probably still at it. As he walked out, we both knew these weren't isolated incidents. They were nodes in a map that you could trace if you wanted to. Rest stops, desolate exits, yards that closed behind you, names whispered to trick you into opening the door of your vehicle. The map itself was ugly. The act of tracing it was uglier. But awareness is a tool, and telling these stories is how we sharpen that tool. I drove away from that diner with Travis's words echoing, and Caleb's yard still in my head. The road stretched out. On the radio, a song came and went, something ordinary that didn't match the way my skin felt under the cab light. I thought about silence again, about how it can be a weapon as much as a symptom. I thought about the small choices we make. To stop, to help, to look. And I thought about the spaces we use to trust without thought and how they'd become, for some people, a playground. The highway toward Nevada is a long, straight ribbon with a horizon that never promises company. The part of Travis's tale I didn't get to hear, the part where he gets past the first strange moments and into the decision that either diffuses or escalates, was the part I wanted to sit with under the fluorescence of a truck stop, just to hear how the minutes had felt. The man who knew his daughter's name had slipped into the space around them like a shadow, and there was a tightening in the air that suggested he had plans that relied on time and driver decisions. It's an odd thing to watch how ordinary gestures, pulling over, offering a ride, shutting off a generator, can be folded into someone else's design. You start to see the road less as a benign expanse and more like a stage where people can choose to play roles. Some play them honestly, some don't. I was still thinking about that when I passed the exit for Vegas, and the desert opened wide. The light in the rearview was distant, a tiny, patient candle. The night pressed against the cab like a hand. Ahead of me, the highway cut through blackness. Behind me, in the diner, people picked at their plates and drove on. The road, in all its indifferent ways, kept going. I was a few miles out when my phone buzzed, just a text from a dispatcher with a standard confirmation. The quiet in the cab felt different now, layered with memory. The sense of being watched came not from an eye at the window, but from the accumulation of small breaches, the tapping on a trailer, the man who smiled too calmly, the name that landed like a hook. The predator's playground isn't a place on a map so much as the space where courtesy and routine meet someone else's calculation. I made a mental note of things I would change: park closer to exits when I could, avoid areas where the lights were dimmed to nightlight levels, and always keep one hand on the keychain. None of it felt dramatic. It felt like drilling another notch in a life already full of notches. It felt like survival. Travis's story, as he told the setup, had one of those pauses that tells you there's more. He left out the finish line the way someone leaves a beating out of a story when the wound's not yet ready to be touched. That omission hung between us like a held breath. I drove on toward the black strip of interstate, thinking about how many drivers were pulling over that night and how many times someone might take a wrong turn into a setup masked as need. The highway is full of human scripts, and some people learn how to read them and exploit them. Even now, years after that night on I-10, I find my ears pricked when the rest stop goes quiet. I find myself mapping the spaces as I go, where the cameras are, which lots are lit, which yards have too many men moving the way Caleb described. You don't become a different person on the road. You just add another lens to the same one you've always used. I could tell you how Travis ended up getting out of that situation, how he made a decision that bought him space, or how he created a small public theater that made continuing the conversation impossible. But that part of his story belongs to him. What I can tell you is this. The moment you realize someone knows private things about you without access is the point where ordinary kindness stops being a safe currency. After that, everything becomes a calculation. The night eased into a dawn that looked thin and brittle, the kind of dawn that makes the desert look more honest. I kept driving. Somewhere ahead, the next stop loomed, a place with its own shadows and its own routines. The road hadn't changed. The people on it had. The Predator's playground is not a place, I kept thinking. It's a set of openings, a truck with a quiet fridge, a stranded car, a yard that closes its gate. And the only thing that keeps you from becoming a part of it is the weight of decisions made in small split seconds. When I next pulled over, I thought of Caleb and the way the gate sagged. I thought of glass and of how a single sound can change everything. I thought of silence sitting in the cab like a weight. I took off my jacket, cleaned the spot of blood from my arm with an antiseptic wipe, and watched the highway for a while. The road looked the same as always, endless and indifferent, but I felt different within it. A rig rolled past, lights bright. A coyote yipped at the side of the road. A radio station carried the sound of a woman laughing. Somewhere in a yard, men moved things in neat stacks. The world went on and I went with it, listening for the pauses that meant trouble. I kept the cab lights low and the engine at a slow idle for a while longer than I needed to. Dawn came on soft and thin, and the world outside the windshield felt like it had been washed in a pale, indecisive grey. I thought about Caleb more than I had planned to. His voice, flat, businesslike, hadn't tried to sell me on what he'd done. He'd described the gate sagging, the chain catching, the narrow seam of possibility. He'd said it plainly, like listing cargo weights. There was no flourish. That was the thing that bothered me. You could tell the story without a tremor, and still feel the tremor deep inside. When I finally stopped to stretch and get coffee, there were other drivers in the lot, half an hour into their own mornings. Faces like maps. A few of them had heard parts of the stories we swapped between cities, tales about quiet trailers, odd pickups, men who knew names they shouldn't. We trade them like weather reports. They help you plan a route in your head. But you don't tell everything. There's an etiquette to how much you share. I found Caleb at a truck stop a week later. He was the kind of man whose jacket smelled faintly of diesel and coffee, and who kept his hands folded at the table like they might be useful for counting time. He didn't want to embellish. He answered questions with the same economy he used when he moved a load. Just what was necessary, no more. They had the look of men who do this a lot, he said without drama. Not nervous, not drunk, clear. Like a crew with a job and a timetable. That's what set it apart. I could feel it when they moved boxes. He tapped the laminated manifest in front of him, as if that little sheet were a holy text that hadn't been followed. Caleb had filed a report with his company, and with local law enforcement. The company forwarded their basic notes. Dispatch logged it. The yard's owners told the investigator they had no record of an unscheduled transfer. Cameras in the area had been conveniently obscured by glare or positioned at odd angles. The kind of small structural failings that are never deliberate until you need them to be different. There were, Caleb said, too many gaps to make anyone comfortable with a neat resolution. That was how these things often go. You file the report. You get polite interest. You get a visit from a man who smells faintly of aftershave and forms, who takes your statement in a tone designed to make the world look administratively solvable. Sometimes they find something. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes the people behind the incidents are already moving on to the next lot, the next rest stop. What lingered in Caleb's tone was less the frustration of a dead-end investigation than the rearrangement of the map he carried in his head. He said, "I started checking who was actually on their docks before I drove in, not as a habit at first. I did it because the hair on my neck told me to, but then it became routine. He admitted that even that change felt like a small surrender. You trade a little of your speed, a little of your openness, for a sense of safety. You lose some of your spontaneity. The three of us, me, Travis, Caleb, had different ways of explaining what happened that night. For me, it was the silence that had the wrong weight. For Travis, it was the name that landed where a name shouldn't. For Caleb, it was the choreography of men and the way the environment was arranged to box a person in. But the same architecture ran through them all. A staged scene, a predator who assumed drivers would fill in the blanks with empathy, and a set of small cues meant to make you behave predictably. I kept thinking about that choreography. Predators learn rhythm. They copy the rituals. They watch the hours when tiredness softens judgment. They map where drivers favor a certain stretch, where the lighting goes thin, which loading yards push people into tight corridors. They use the ordinary details of truck life, helping with a hood, the courtesy of a wave, a generator that's off, and fold those things into a script. It's efficient, and when it works, almost invisible. Those who make their living on the road are used to a baseline risk. We face weather, fatigue, and a calendar that bends us into odd schedules. But risk from other people has a different contour. It's not just danger, it's a moral puzzle. You want to help. You were raised not long ago on a set of rules that said you stop for stranded drivers. That habit becomes a vulnerability when someone else knows how to exploit the kindness coded into decency. After those nights, I started noticing the small changes among drivers. It wasn't always dramatic. Someone started parking next to a lit area every night as a group habit. People circulated a list in the forums of rest stops that had good light and cameras. A handful of drivers formed an informal network. If one guy pulled into a lot and felt uneasy, he'd leave a message on the board, and someone would check in. On the CB, a voice might say, "Watch I-10 rest stop at mile marker," and that would be enough for 10 rigs to shift a mile away. We learned to language our fear, so it didn't paralyze us. We rehearsed phrases, "Not tonight, brother," that allowed us to refuse without cruelty. We practiced the exact way to close the door on a conversation, to step back and not meet the eye. You find ways to be human that keep you safer. Not everyone took the same lessons. Some drivers doubled down on caution until it looked like paranoia. Others refused to change at all, insisting that the highway was still a place to trust strangers. Both responses made sense to me. We are stubborn people in our work. What worries me is not the diversity of reaction, but the cost of silence. That we don't talk about near misses in enough detail to build patterns without creating blueprints. There were small victories too. A yard in a border town replaced some of its burnt-out bulbs after drivers complained. A rest stop got new signage and hired an overnight attendant who made sure trailers weren't left in odd formations. Those changes were incremental, not dramatic. They fit the way truck life moves, slow, nickeling and dimpling rather than cinematic and abrupt. Occasionally something sharp happened that forced people to act faster. Another driver I know posted a picture to a private group, an image of a pickup parked at a weird angle beside a rig, 2 men leaning like sculptures over a tarp that didn't match any manifest. Word spread. Someone who worked nights at a truck stop called in a favor, and local law enforcement showed up the next shift. Whether anything came of it, I don't know. But the act of reporting it, of naming the oddity, changed the conversation for a few drivers who otherwise might have shrugged. One thing that surprised me was how much we relied on each other for tacit rules. A lot of drivers don't fully trust the system, dispatch, police, company protocols, so we made small customs for ourselves. If you get a weird vibe in a yard, and you go to your company and say, "I'm not unloading tonight," you might get an earful about schedules and payments. If you leave a place because you feel trapped, that can complicate a paycheck. Those practicalities shape behavior. Not everyone can afford to risk a late fee or a delay. That economic pressure is part of what predators exploit, whether they're thinking about it that way or not. Privacy plays its part too. When I hesitated to give all the details about my I-10 night, it wasn't only pride. There are real costs to being fully transparent. Word can ricochet through the community in ways you can't control. That can be protective, or it can be harmful. People get curious, people speculate, Names that ought to stay private show up where you don't want them. So some of us tuck stories like old maps into our top drawers, only pulling them out for those we trust. It's worth saying clearly, reporting matters. Even if the justice system moves slowly, even if an investigation stalls, putting something on record builds a pattern. Patterns are the enemy of predators. Patterns allow investigators to see a string where before there were only beads. I say that like it's easy. It's not. It calls for trust in systems that have frustrated us. But it's necessary. These nights change you in small ways. They teach you to lean into practical caution instead of heroism. They also teach you about grief. Not the sort you can put in a box, but the quiet recalibration of the life you thought you were living. You keep driving, but you drive with new borders drawn around your kindness. The map is the same, but there are shaded areas you avoid now, rules you adopt without fanfare. I won't pretend the changes are neat or always rational. After my window was hit on I-10, I found myself pausing at intersections I used to sail through. I timed lights, like I had an extra heartbeat to protect. When a kid on the overpass waved, I sometimes didn't wave back. These are small losses, but real ones. You don't lose faith in people wholesale, you just add a layer. You become, in some ways, more efficient at living in a world that sometimes wears a wolf's mask. One evening, a month or so after the yard incident, I got a call from Caleb. He'd been assigned to a run that skirted near the area where his yard had been, a place he had been avoiding. He took it. He said he had to prove to himself that he could still do the job without letting one bad night rewrite the entire ledger of his life. When I met him later, he had a new habit. He asked for the yard manager's radio channel and made sure someone on site acknowledged his presence before he pulled in. It was an innocuous step, and it sounded like one until you stacked it against what he might have done before. It was a pattern of proactive verification, grotesquely simple, but effective at giving him a pause to reposition if something felt wrong. Nobody wins by pretending we didn't make a mistake, Caleb said. But we also don't want to live in fear, we want to keep moving. He was weary in a way that didn't beg for sympathy. It just recorded facts. His life had a new set of variables, and he carried them like gear, checking them before he drove off. The human stuff around these events, marriages, kids, days missed, small economies balanced between runs, matters. When someone like Travis hears a name called that shouldn't be known, it's not merely an intrusion. It's a breach of a private map that is stitched into daily life. When someone like me gets a window smashed, it is a physical punctuation mark on an evening that was otherwise ordinary. When someone like Caleb sees organized movement in a yard, it's a disclosure that the world of legitimate commerce and criminal enterprise have porous seams. All of that is messy, and none of it leaves neat narratives behind. The predators themselves often remain faceless in the end. You imagine them as methodical, like machine operators who learn where the levers are. Sometimes they're opportunists. Sometimes they're organized teams using legitimate business cover to move stolen goods, scramble manifests, or simply corner a driver. The common denominator is not a caricature of evil. It's a set of behaviors shaped by patience, by observation, by the capacity to wait for you to fix the world for them. So what do you carry forward? The answers are unsatisfactory but honest. You carry awareness, you carry a revised set of habits, and you carry stories that get told quietly over coffee and in the glow of CB radios. You make small practical adjustments. Park near exits when you can. Prefer lots with cameras and attendants. Avoid giving rides in areas without traffic or witnesses, not because you're paranoid, but because you are prudent. I want to be careful here. I'm not offering tactical advice on how to block a pickup or how to break through a chain. There are lines you don't cross with this kind of storytelling because the point is not to arm someone for violence. It's to sharpen the sense that makes non-violent survival more likely. The line between useful warning and harmful instructions is thin and important. I also want to emphasize the moral instruction we learned without meaning to. Civility doesn't require vulnerability. You can be courteous and not be obligating yourself into a dangerous situation. You can ask for help in other ways. You can call for an attendant to assist. You can create a small stage delay that lets you assess risk without making an enemy of kindness. Those are not heroic moves, they're just calibration. The emotional toll of all this can't be quantified in logs and manifests. I think most of us feel it like a new density in the air around the wheels. Little things. Someone parked too close, a phone buzzing at an odd hour, register differently now. You sleep with one ear tuned to the radiator and the other to the radio. You learn to notice how quickly someone can shift from conversational to controlling without making a scene. These are skills you pick up like a language. There is also a small tenderness that grows in these communities. Drivers watch out for one another, sometimes in ways the public might not notice. You'll see a string of rigs pull up to form a kind of human curtain at a lot where you've heard about trouble. You'll see someone hand over an extra sandwich to a driver whose run got extended by a reroute. Those gestures don't make the headlines, but they're the fabric that helps people sleep. The road, for all its threats, is still the locus of work and life for many of us. We like the open ribbon, the solitude that lets you think, the radio that becomes a companion. These stories, as grim as they are, don't change why we drive. They change how we do it. That change is a survival strategy and a way to keep earning a living while preserving as much humanity as we can. I drove home later that week, feeling the old engine's rhythm sync with a new cadence in my head. The act of telling these stories, of laying them out like panels on a table, felt like mapping a territory with more care. I thought about the word playground in the title that had first been in my mind when I started recording these nights. The road becomes a predator's playground. It fit in a stark way. A playground is a place where rules are learned and boundaries tested. The difference on the road is that the stakes are higher, and the players more anonymous. That metaphor held, danger softened by routine, predators testing the equipment of human decency. I don't want to leave you with a sense that we all hide and never help again. There are runs where helping is necessary, and where the kindness of a single moment prevents something worse. There are times when stopping for someone is the right thing to do. The point is to bring intention to those choices, rather than letting exhaustion or compassion alone decide. If there's a final thought that ties these 3 nights together, it's this. Predators on the road rely on predictable responses. They stage scenes that fit the scripts we all learned. Stop and help. Take the offer of a small kindness. Trust the face that needs help. Breaking the script doesn't require courage. It requires awareness and practiced refusal when something feels wrong. Small, non-confrontational acts. Looking for light, asking for identification, moving to a more public area, can give you the space to make safer choices. It's not brave. It's careful. I've seen drivers recover their sense of normal in different ways. Travis still drives. He still tells the story, but with a different parenthesis. He refuses rides on lonely stretches. He calls ahead. Caleb found a rhythm where he picked assignments that kept him from spending long nights boxed in yards. Me? I still carry the ache of being hit, the nick on my arm. I still sleep in the cab and sometimes wake to the sound of a truck rolling past, heart racing. But I also keep driving because I like the work, because the horizon keeps calling me, because the life I've built on the road is stubborn in its pull. These 3 nights, my I-10 window, Travis's Namer nose, Caleb's yard trap, are part of a larger ledger. They are warnings and reminders. Predators don't always look like nightmares. They often look like ordinary people practicing habits. They watch and wait for the gaps. But we learn too. We learn to watch for the small cluster of cues that mean this isn't right, and we learn to choose actions that preserve life over courtesy. If any of these stories stayed with you, tell us which one and where you're listening from. Share this with someone who drives nights or who has family on the road. These stories are useful when we pass them on, not as a way to scare, but as a way to teach the simple, practical habits that keep people safe. If you want more true road encounters, subscribe to the channel. Tell us which of these 3 scenes stuck with you and where you're tuning in from. Drive safe.